In 2006, the global economy felt invincible. Inflation was low, growth was steady, and the business cycle, that old monster of booms and busts, seemed to have been tamed. Economists called it the Great Moderation. Central bankers believed they had finally found the secret sauce of mathematics and policy to prevent another Great Depression. But while the world was popping champagne, two scholars were looking at the party through a much darker lens. Carmen Reinhart and Kenneth Rogoff identified a recurring psychological trap. They called it the "this time is different" syndrome. It's the belief that old rules no longer apply because of a new technology, a new type of financial product, or a smarter government. In the 1920s, it was the automobile and radio. In the 1990s, the internet. In the mid-2000s, it was financial engineering and subprime mortgages. Their thesis was simple but terrifying. No matter how modern we think we are never immune to the 800-year-old patterns of human greed and debt. They weren't your typical ivory tower academics. Rogoff was a chess grandmaster who understood the long game of strategy. Reinhart was a Cuban-American economist with a legendary nose for data, often spotting crises in emerging markets before the smoke even appeared. Together they spent years doing what most economists hate, digging through centuries of poorly translated ledgers, dusty government records, and forgotten archives. They weren't looking for a theory, they were looking for the financial DNA of a collapse. In early 2008, months before the world actually broke, they released a warning shot. They argued that the U.S. was following the exact same path as the 1990s, Japanese collapse, and the 19th century UK panics. They predicted a massive debt crisis. People laughed until the banks started failing. This is the story of how they got it right and how a single spreadsheet error almost wiped their legacy away. Most economic models look back 20, maybe 30 years. Reinhart and Rogoff decided that wasn't enough. They went back 8 centuries. We're talking about data archaeology, digging through archives to find inflation rates in the Ming Dynasty and default records from the Napoleonic Wars. They realized that if you only look at the last few decades, you're looking at a quiet period of history. To see the monster, you have to look at the whole timeline. They compiled a database of 66 countries and nearly 1,000 years of financial history to prove one thing. Crises aren't black swans. They are hardy perennials. They grow, they bloom, they die, and they always come back. Through this mountain of data, they identified a DNA for financial collapse. It usually starts with a surge in capital flowing into a country. This leads to a banking crisis. Think bank runs or massive bailouts. That usually triggers a currency crash. And finally, the grand finale, the sovereign default, where the government simply says, "We can't pay you back." By tracking these 3 horsemen across 800 years, they found that the symptoms are almost identical in 14th century Europe as they were in 20th century Latin America. By 2007, Reinhart and Rogoff weren't just looking at history. They were looking at a mirror. They developed a pre-crisis template. When they applied it to the United States in the mid-2000s, the lights turned red across the board. Real estate prices were skyrocketing, the trade deficit was ballooning, and most importantly, debt was reaching levels that, historically, always ended in tears. While others saw a new economy, Reinhart and Rogoff saw the 801st year of financial folly. They weren't just predicting a recession, they were predicting a systemic heart attack. In 2010, the world was still reeling from the Great Recession. Governments were spending trillions on bailouts and stimulus, and the question on everyone's mind was, how much debt is too much? Reinhart and Rogoff provided the answer that shook the world. They claimed to have found a tipping point. According to their data, when a country's public debt crossed 90% of its GDP, economic growth didn't just slow down, it plummeted. It wasn't a gradual slope, it was a cliff. This wasn't just another academic paper. It became a political weapon. In the US, it was cited in the Path to Prosperity budget. In Europe, it became the intellectual backbone for austerity, the policy of cutting government spending to reduce debt. If the 90% rule was true, then spending more money to jumpstart the economy was like pouring gasoline on a fire. Leaders from London to Athens used Reinhart and Rogoff's names to justify painful cuts to social services and infrastructure. By 2012, Carmen Reinhart and Kenneth Rogoff were arguably the most influential economists on the planet. They had predicted the crash when others hadn't, and now they were providing the roadmap for the recovery. Their 800 years of data seemed unassailable. But while the world's leaders were treating their spreadsheet as gospel, a 28-year-old graduate student at the University of Massachusetts was about to find a hole in the armor. And it all started with a simple click in Microsoft Excel. In 2013, Thomas Herndon was a 28-year-old grad student at UMass Amherst. For his homework, he was assigned to replicate the famous Reinhart-Rogoff study. It should have been a routine exercise, but no matter how many times he ran the numbers, he couldn't get his results to match theirs. He didn't see a growth cliff at 90% debt. He saw nothing unusual. He thought he was the one making the mistake. He checked his work again and again. Finally, he reached out to the giants themselves and asked for their original spreadsheet. When the spreadsheet arrived, Herndon found something that would go down in the halls of infamous math. It wasn't a complex theoretical flaw. It was a coding slip. In their Excel formula, Reinhart and Rogoff had accidentally excluded 5 countries from their average. By missing those rows, they had inadvertently weighted the data toward a few countries that had high debt and low growth, like post-war Japan, while ignoring high-debt countries that were actually doing just fine. The fallout was immediate and brutal. Critics argued that the 90% rule, the very foundation of global austerity, was based on a typo. The intellectual giants were suddenly the subjects of late-night comedy. But the real damage wasn't just to their reputations. It was to the policies they influenced. If the cliff didn't exist, had millions of people suffered through budget cuts and unemployment for a mathematical ghost? Reinhart and Rogoff fought back, admitting the error but insisting their main conclusion held true. High debt is still a drag on growth. But the aura of invincibility was gone. Fast forward to today. The 90% cliff may have been debunked as a hard rule, but the world has blown past that marker anyway. In the wake of global shocks and massive stimulus, national debts are at levels unseen since World War II. We are living in the debt trap Reinhart and Rogoff warned about. It's not a sudden heart attack, it's a slow, grinding weight. Every dollar spent servicing interest is a dollar not spent on the future, on fusion energy, on AI ethics, or on the next generation of schools. The drag they predicted is no longer a theory. For many nations, it's a daily reality. History has a way of silencing the critics. While the Excel error was a blow to their pride, their core message remains the most important lesson in financial history. Leverage is a drug. When it's cheap, it feels like a miracle. When the bill comes due, it feels like a curse. Reinhart and Rogoff reminded us that we are not special or evolved. We are subject to the same cycles of exuberance and exhaustion that collapsed Rome and bankrupted the British Empire. Their data proved that the most expensive words in any language will always be, "This time is different." So, are we in another "this time is different" moment? As we look at the soaring debts of 2026, it's easy to believe our new technologies will save us from the old math. But if 800 years of history have taught Carmen Reinhart and Kenneth Rogoff anything, it's that the archives are more predictive than the algorithms. The next crisis is already being written in the ledgers of today. The only question is, will we read the warning signs this time? If you want to dive deeper into the math that moves the world, hit subscribe and join the conversation in the comments below.